Good evening. This is fluid compartments and their ionic compositions. My name is Hannah Antosh, and this presentation is for Dr. Brittany Smith. It is the last presentation for Biology 520, Human Anatomy and Physiology 2. Today we're going to talk about the two main fluid compartments of the body. So the first one is intracellular fluid. And intracellular fluid is going to be fluid that is found within the cells. Based on the name intra. The next one is going to be extracellular fluid, and there are two main components to this. Plasma, which we can see right here. Plasma is going to be the fluid that is found within veins, capillaries, arteries, any type of blood vessels where we're going to find plasma. We also have interstitial fluid, which is going to be found anywhere where there is not blood. So starting with intercellular fluid, or intracellular fluid, I should have said. Intracellular fluid comprises about 2/3 of the body's overall water concentration. And this water concentration is actually very highly regulated. And I shouldn't say water concentration, I should say fluid concentration. It's very highly regulated. If you remember back to an intro to biology class, when we learned about osmosis, right, we learned that water moves down the concentration gradient. It's going to move from an area with a high concentration to a low concentration. So when cells are in a fluid that does not have tons of solute within it, if you do the egg lab, right, where you take an egg and you dissolve its shell using vinegar and you're left with a great picture of a cell, right? When we take that shellless egg and we put it in a beaker of water, we have a distinct difference in concentration levels. So obviously that beaker of water is going to have way less solutes than our egg. And so that is going to result in more water moving into the cell than what is moving out. Typically, we want to see an equal amount of water moving in and water moving out. That keeps that intracellular composition pretty steady. But when we don't have that, when there's a higher concentration in the cell than out, water's going to flow from high to low. It's going to do its thing, right? And cells can swell up and lyse, right? They'll burst. Conversely, when a cell is in a place with too much solutes and not enough fluid, water's going to move from within the cell to without the cell. And that is going to cause a cell to shrivel. Now, moving on to extracellular fluid components, there are, like I said earlier, two main categories of extracellular fluids. We have our interstitial fluids, which is going to be fluid that surround cells that are not surrounded by blood. I remember as a kid thinking that blood just free flowed throughout our whole bodies. And it wasn't until I was older, probably like 5 or 6, because I was a precocious kid who watched a whole lot of Animal Planet Discovery Channel, and we learned about the circulatory system, right? The circulatory system contains all of our blood. It's not just free floating. So what is in fact, getting all of these nutrients and water and oxygen to our cells? Well, it's interstitial fluid, right? It lies in the space between the cells and it makes the exchanges with those cells that are not found within that circulatory system. The other component is plasma, and that's the fluid that's found within blood, right? Not the red blood cells, which is what gives blood its characteristic red color, but rather just the fluid that's in it. And there are two more minor categories of extracellular fluids. We have lymph, which is fluid that goes back to the plasma from the interstitial fluid. Okay, so it's coming from, it's done its exchanges, and now it's moving back into the bloodstream, back into that plasma. And it actually goes through a cleaning system where it's filtered through the lymph nodes before it goes back into action. And this is a huge part of our immune system. We also have something called transcellular fluid, and this is going to be specialized fluid that's secreted by specialized cells. And it has very specific purposes. So examples of this could be cerebrospinal fluid, ocular fluid, synovial fluid. And cerebrospinal fluid is going to be the fluid that's found within your nervous system, Ocular fluid works to do its thing with eyes. I don't pay a lot of attention to eyes. Eyes and ears gross me out, and anatomy can't do it. Synovial fluid, then you have like your cardiac fluids like pericardial, intrapleural, and peritoneal fluids. Also, digestive fluids are another example of a transcellular fluid. Now, these fluid components are typically going to remain stable. Can they be disrupted? Yes. Example that could be, in glaucoma, when a body has too much ocular fluid, right? That ocular fluid levels have been monkeyed with, they've been played around with, they're not where they should be. And also, when you get the nasty stomach bug, we have norovirus going around in our school system right now. I had it, my kids had it, my husband had it. Terrible thing. But that vomiting diarrhea, what's happening is that actually is messing with the levels of digestive juices that are where they're supposed to be. When you are having vomiting and diarrhea, obviously you're losing a lot more fluids than what you're taking in. And so that can cause obviously some fairly major issues that we talked about with those red blood cells, right? When you're losing too much fluid, you're not gaining solutes, but the concentrations are off. Anyway, but even though these fluids make up a relatively small portion of the body's composition, they are very, very important. Now, ignore this guy right here. But plasma and interstitial fluid are actually have very similar compositions. Both have sodium ions and potassium ions for their cations, as well as HCO3 and chlorine as their anions, and they have all of these in very similar proportions to each other. However, the main difference between plasma and interstitial fluid is that interstitial fluids do not contain proteins while plasma does. Now, intracellular fluids, however, are very, very different. Where plasma and interstitial fluids both contain more sodium than potassium, intracellular fluid contains more potassium than sodium, and it contains PO4 rather than HCO3. And I reference down here, but figure 15.2 in the textbook has a great graph to show this. So if you think back to Biology 101, right, remember that cells, like I talked about earlier, cells are surrounded by a highly selective semi-permeable membrane, right? And this membrane decides what is and is not allowed to pass through. Whether that is active transport or passive transport, that membrane is highly selective. And so it allows some things to cross, but not others. And that movement of ions is typically going to be electrically balanced, right? Typically, sodium is going to move with chlorine, right? Creating an electrically balanced coupling. One of our major differences between extracellular fluids and intercellular fluids is that the cell proteins that are within that intercellular fluid, they are not allowed to cross through the membranes. Okay, that is a no-go, off-limits portion. Sodium and potassium, however, can move through freely, and as can their chaperones, which is just a way I like to talk about anions, right? Sodium and potassium typically aren't going to move by themselves within this movement guy we've got going on. They're typically going to go with an anion to create an electrically balanced movement there. And then move due to active transport. Sodium is going to be the primary cation. As I referenced earlier, sodium is typically going to be the primary cation for the extracellular fluid, while potassium is the primary cation for intracellular fluid. Remember, the cations are just positively charged ions. I like to think of it as cats are positive because they kill mice, and I don't like mice. And anions are negative because, well, ants are never a good sign. Now, how does the body maintain a balance of fluid? Well, all materials and water have to be exchanged within that intracellular fluid through extracellular fluid. Okay, they can't occur by themselves. They have to use a proxy, which is that extracellular fluid, right? That allows for that water and gas and material exchange between the cells and their surroundings. Okay, so when a person drinks water, drinks lemonade, right? That water is going to go into that extracellular fluid, taken to wherever it needs to go, does this thing, and then when it's time for it to go, okay, it's going to leave through that extracellular fluid. That's where it's going to get to where it's getting. Plasma is the only component of these that can act to control its volume and composition. And there's two main factors that affect fluid balance. And the first one is extracellular fluid volume and extracellular fluid osmolarity. And both of these factors are going to depend on salts, NaCl, and water levels. And the factors that we use, the mechanisms that we use to control these factors are vastly different. So to control volume, that extracellular fluid volume, we regulate that to maintain an acceptable blood pressure, right? We don't want our blood pressure to be too high, don't want it to be too low. So we need to keep it within an acceptable range. And there are short and long-term solutions that the body has to controlling blood pressure. A short solution is using that baroreceptor reflex or temporary fluid shifts from the plasma to the interstitial fluids. Long-term kidney function and thirst control and thirst sense, those control urine output and water input, maintaining that, trying to get that sodium levels to where they need to be. And then osmolarity prevents, like I talked about earlier with those blood cells, that's going to prevent the shrinking and swelling of the cells. Remember that's going to be controlled by the sodium concentrations, right? If a cell is in a environment that is too salty, like my sense of humor, right? If it's in an environment that's too salty, it's going to shrivel up. Whereas if it is an environment that is too not salty enough, it will lyse and burst. And those sodium levels actually also control the extracellular fluid volume. And those sodium levels can be controlled a couple ways, either by the glomerular filtration rate, and also can be controlled by the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. Both of these systems work to maintain sodium levels. Thank you so much. Have a great night.